But I do have a pet theory about costumes because
Ooh.
we're in a cultural moment where we are absolutely obsessed with identity, as all of our listeners know, and as you well know. And Halloween gives you a full wardrobe, so to speak, to platform test identities.
Hello, and welcome to Thinking Out Loud. I'm your co-host, Nathan Rittenhouse.
And I'm your co-host, Cameron McAllister.
And you are listening to the third, I believe this is our third annual, ever so slight disagreement on the value of Halloween. So in the years past, we've always kind of kicked this around. Cameron's doing some convincing, some creative thinking, some strategic analysis. And he's going to give you his read on why Halloween is one of his favorite holidays. And then I'll probably comment here and there with snide remarks, and altogether we'll craft something that is livable and humorous, if nothing else. So, with all that said, we hand it over to Cameron because actually Cameron's been thinking about this even more than he had been in the past and has some even more refined thoughts on it. So, brace yourself for here comes Cameron.
Yeah, all Cameron can do at this point is let you down based on that description. You use the word refined. Yeah. And as one of our very intelligent listeners has said, on this one, Cameron's just wrong. So,
Yeah, well, that's quite possible.
right. So just take whatever I say with a grain of salt. But yeah, we do want to talk a little bit about Halloween. First of all, Halloween is more popular than it's ever been. I
Oh,
think,
and I have numbers to go with that. Wall
yeah,
Street
let's hear the
Journal.
numbers. Let's,
We're
yeah,
spending
yeah.
So the US is going to spend 10.6 billion on Halloween this fall, which is a significant increase from last year, including 1.7 billion on adult costumes. So this is not your
Wow.
little neighborhood Spider-Man with a Reese's cup. This is and it does feel to me like maybe I mean, I did grow up in a hole on this whole conversation, but does it seem like it has more of an adult flair to it now than it did like 10 years ago? Or
It absolutely does.
okay,
Yeah. And
okay.
it's competing with Christmas now in terms of holiday dominance. So that's really quite something. And I actually don't think that's a good thing, by the way. And many of the change with the trends that you just mentioned, I don't think are good things either. So let me preface this by saying, well, two things. I want to I want to throw some context here, throw out here so we can situate Halloween, I think, properly. And that'll sort of structure our conversation. But then I think we also want to talk about a certain very, oh, how do I put it, unnerving incident in that comes from First Samuel chapter 28 involving
Oh,
King
here
Saul,
come the
and a
witches.
witch.
Brace yourself.
Hmm.
Okay. Yeah. All right.
Yes.
There's a
So
little teaser for the future of where we're going here.
right, yeah, because thematically, obviously, that's a spooky story, and it really is, and so we want to talk about that a little bit. But first of all, let me, at the risk of reciting facts for you that you could just look up on Wikipedia, let me give you some details that you may not know about Halloween in the United States. So most people know that Halloween does have some pagan origins, which go all the way back to Druidic practices
Oh, just like
in
Christmas.
there we
Yeah.
go.
Well,
Oh,
while we're
man.
down on everything. No, sorry, I interrupted. Go
Nathan is trolling here today, ladies and
ahead.
gentlemen. But yeah, so goes back to Druidic practices from Celtic peoples. The history there is quite murky, by the way. So it's hard to
Mhm.
to draw definitive conclusions. But there clearly are pagan precedents, and they have to do with Samhain, spelled Sam Hain. Many people will say Sam Hain, but the pronunciation is actually Samhain or Samhain. So it's one of those two. But essentially, one of the convictions is, and this is a familiar theme. You've heard this. There are various iterations of this in pagan assumptions, but that on a certain day of the year, the line separating the physical world from the spiritual world becomes much more thin, and you're much more vulnerable to evil spirits. And so at one point, donning Halloween costumes was actually a practice that was meant to disguise you and fool evil spirits and thus protect you. So is there some of that hovering in the background? Yes. So there are some red flags right there for a lot of folks.
Oh, hey, hang on. I wasn't actually trolling you on the Christmas joke. I mean, that's where
No?
Christmas trees come from too, is the same
Yes.
culture. So,
Yes,
I
yeah,
yeah, I was only mildly I was meaning it in that sense. So, the syncretism, because
sure.
syncretism is gonna be an issue that I think we get into here as we push into that, and I just wanted to be an equal opportunity offender. So,
No,
sorry,
and that
okay.
and totally fair. So, yes, it is. And so that's definitely the case here. And you have those elements that are in play, but you also have, and here again, the history is murky. You have the church trying to intervene at some point a while ago. I think it's 8, maybe 800 or something like that is the date. And again, you have you know All Souls Day, and then, well, I think it's All Saints Day came first,
Mhm.
but then the one that really catches on is All Souls Day, sort of catches on. But
Or
again,
All Hallows we Eve.
right, so honest church historians are quite clear that the history of how the church's intervention looks is actually also quite cryptic and murky. All right. So there are some of the ancient details, but then Halloween in the United States is really weird too. Why is this a national holiday? Well, really, that has to do with immigrants who had come, especially Irish immigrants who are fleeing the potato famine. And they have retained some of these practices, right? Because they're coming from Great Britain. And the one unique feature to American life is trick or treating. So somehow in the great melting pot, strange amalgamation experiment that is the United States, new practices emerge, trick or treating being one of them. And another thing happens. The government wants to gear this holiday toward kids because apparently they were dealing with quite a bit of mayhem and vandalism when it was in the hands of adults. And so there's a concerted effort to make this more of a children's holiday. And I think it officially becomes recognized as a national holiday geared mainly toward children in the 1920s or the 1930s.
Hmm. I
So
did
that's
not
a
know
little
that.
b Yeah, I didn't know that either. That was a recent discovery I made, and I thought, "I let's look a little bit into just some of the details and circumstances." So, there you have some of the circumstances that I think help set the context for Halloween in the United States.
Well, yeah, the Irish connection is particularly fascinating. That means that here in the next day or two, you're gonna have little people running around your neighborhood dressed up for the same reason that we dye the Chicago River green at certain times of the year. So,
Yeah.
the cultural contributions there continue.
Yeah, they do. Now, I have some thoughts here about what's happening in recent trends, and like I said, I don't think that they're necessarily good. So let me also just be really clear on what it is that I like. It's not so much that I really love Halloween itself as a holiday, even though I think it can be fun to take. I do take my kids trick or treating, and I want to tread carefully here because I know some listeners have real issues with that, and I want to take that seriously. We want to discuss that because one of the principles I will always say when it comes to any form of cultural engagement that's in gray territory, gray just meaning that scripture doesn't provide you with explicit protocol for dealing with it. But one of the principles that we have to do, one of the broad principles we do have is never, under any circumstances, violate your conscience. So if you can't, in good conscience, engage with Halloween or take your kids trick or treating, then by no means do it. Absolutely. So I'm completely on board with that. But I like this time of year. I like scary movies. So a few of those elements tend to sort of
Oh, I mean, come on. No, you're
are
not surprising
concentrated in
anybody
this time
here.
of year.
You went to a satanic metal concert recently, and I'm looking at you, and you have a picture of a sad clown on the wall behind you.
Right.
So I don't think
Yeah.
you have to justify yourself to anybody who's been a long time listener to the you are the man for this hour, Cameron.
Yeah, so I mean, I like some of those elements. I love and clowns. Yeah, so I like carnivals and fairs and amusement parks and and the kind of atmosphere in those places. So all of that, yes, is densely concentrated around this time of year. So, but some of the trends that I think. So you mentioned it's becoming more of an adult holiday, and I think that's right. That's clearly what's happening. And one of my pet theories on that is, well, first of all, Americans, especially these days, as our culture has grown a little bit more decadent, everything becomes an excuse for partying. So
Mhm.
when with kids want candy, grown-ups want alcohol and sometimes other stuff. And so, I mean, even look at the way one of the things that always makes me laugh are a holiday like Cinco de Mayo or St. Patrick's Day. Both of those, I know a lot of people who are very enthusiastic about quote celebrating those by imbibing heavily, but they know precious little about St. Patrick or
Yeah.
anything, any of the details of Cinco de Mayo. So we like excuses to party in the United States, and Halloween provides one of those. That's not new. But I do have a pet theory about costumes
Mm.
because
Ooh.
we're in a cultural moment where we are absolutely obsessed with identity, as all of our listeners know, and as you well know. And Halloween gives you a full wardrobe, so to speak, to platform test identities. And I really do think
Mhm.
that for many people, Halloween now serves that kind of a function for some of us. Think about the way, I mean, a costume is a very powerful thing and can be a very
Sure.
dangerous thing.
Yeah.
I mean, inhibitions, there are all sorts of inhibitions go out the window, can go out the window. There are all sorts of scary stories, by the way, of what a certain mask will do if you put it on and how it basically unleashes this whole hidden side that, civil society keeps subdued, but then you don the mask and suddenly you're able to be free in a much darker way. I also think of you mentioned the band Ghost. Stage performers who put on elaborate costumes and makeup are often able to be entirely different persons. I always think of Alice Cooper, who is I don't his actual, his Christian name is escaping me. He's a very outspoken believer these days, but when he puts on the makeup and all of that, he can go out there and perform a very ghoulish show, and he feels this degree of freedom. He said this before that he wouldn't if he didn't have the costume on. So those costumes are ways to platform test some of your identity
Okay.
experiments, I think.
So I think that's true. I think one of the places you see that uniquely, go to your local university on Halloween, and you'll see that rather than dressing up, it's dressing off is seen as like one of the
Yeah.
modern college. So it's like expressing yourself as a sexual creature is a big part of this in some atmospheres. But the thing I wanted to get back to is like that idea of a plat. So you said two things there. One is a platform testing identity. I want to push into that, but the idea that it allows you to be something that you normally aren't, like a pressure relief valve. That's
Yeah.
not new, and that,
No.
correct me if I'm wrong, that is historically part of the idea of the carnival, right? Is you have like feast days and these days in which you just Mardi Gras esque
Mhm.
blow off all
Yes.
the repressed steam and energy that you had, and you order society by giving people cheat days on their diet, as it were,
Yes.
morally. Say something about that because that seems to
Yeah.
be a constant theme.
Right. And so that can be, I think, a good thing. And now it can go off the rails if it's not carefully controlled. And there are movies that are about this that some of you will be thinking of a movie like The Purge. For instance, that's a modern horror film where one day a year is a lawless day and you just let out and unleash all the chaos that's in that's in you. And this is and it, so this one night becomes this total horror show. So that's a very extreme parody on this. But yeah, down the ages, and there's a thinker who comes to mind for me here who I think is very helpful. And some of you, I was a guest on a podcast of a friend of ours, Abdu Murray, and I talked a little bit about this. So I may repeat myself a little bit, but I'm getting older and I repeat myself a lot these days. So just indulge me here. But there's the thinker who I think talks about this very well is Mikhail Bakhtin.
Rolls
Good
right off the
Russian
tongue.
name there. Rolls right off the tongue. So Mikhail Bakhtin is probably best remembered when he's remembered at all. He's very respected and revered in academic circles and probably almost nowhere else. He's also a great Dostoevsky scholar, so a lot of people, if you know him, you'll know him for that. But this comes from his book Rabelais and His World, which is a very good book. But in that, he develops this notion of the carnival or the carnivalesque. So if you've seen carnivalesque crop up in a probably literary analysis somewhere, you can thank Mikhail Bakhtin. But essentially, he draws attention to the role that festivals have played down the ages, where, especially in, think about medieval society or a feudal society, where it's intensely hierarchical. And if you're a person who's not part of the nobility, let's say you're a peasant, you are where you are and you're never getting out. You are in that is your social station and you're locked into that
You're in a
social
rut.
station. Except yeah, you're in a rut. Except on festival days when those social codes get relaxed and the way Bakhtin likes to put it is turned up it's the world turned upside down. So all those social hierarchies for a time here, a little spell, are relaxed, and you see the contingency of human society and all of these roles, and they are openly mocked. You see, and mockery and laughter is part of that because you get to see that. Look, even the most exalted figures, the kings, the queens, the judges, and the clergy, with their goofy costumes and all that, they are just costumes and they're still just human beings after all, who have to do all the normal human stuff and go have all the normal human bodily functions. This is a massive source of comedy. Still with us today, by the way, to take somebody who's in an exalted social position or in some form of, some elite social position and then just show their common humanity and play it up for laughs. So
And a little
that's
bit
all
of,
happening in
do political cartoons
cartoonish.
fit
Yep.
into this? I mean, so
Absolutely they
there's
would.
the
Yes.
exaggerations and yeah.
And they're subversive, right?
Mhm.
Because political cartoons are, again, mocking power. And mocking power, by the way, it can, again, all of this can potentially go off the rails and get out of control. It's a very delicate balance, but mocking power is a necessary feature of a healthy society. You got to be able to do that. If power rather is completely unmockable, completely untrumpable, completely invulnerable and inviolable, then you're looking at tyrannical circumstances.
Hmm.
So the festival relaxes some of these social constraints, but also you have in this, pictures of, some of the darker features of life, like death. Think about the Day of the Dead. And again, Bakhtin is going to say, can that turn morbid and dark? Yeah, it can, but it also has healthy manifestations because what do so many of us do in the West? We deny the fact that we're mortal and we deny death and we suppress it and we repress it. And then what happens? We deal with terrible chronic anxiety whenever we start to get wind of the fact that we are going to die, that we're not in control, and that life does break down. But if you have these festivals that openly celebrate it, so to speak, as an aspect of what it means to be a person, you're dealing with it in a way that is simultaneously serious but also fun and brings in some mirth into the so I've brought a whole lot of really kind of nerdy theory into this, but I really do think this is a practical, when this is done well, this can be a healthy kind of exercise for human beings and can be a form of actually even healthy sublimation. But there we are.
Yeah, I think you're giving too much credit to the average American Halloween celebrator. So that's what like that's where I'm stuck in between your analysis because so much of it is like, yes, that I understand that. I get that, and that's good. The other part of me is like, nah, it's not what anybody thinks they're doing. Now, whether or not they need to think about what they're doing in order for it to be good, that would probably be, a viable question. But so let me I really appreciate that. Thank you. And I'm guessing that is the richest analysis that I'm going to hear on that in the next week. So thanks, Cameron. Um, so what's the element though of like we live in a culture now where the festival is continuous.
Mhm.
So
Yep.
in when you're stuck in a rut and there's repression and there's subversion and there's mockery, and there's gluttony, um,
Mhm.
or even relaxed sexual mores on certain days in historical festivals. Um, so like it's crazy. So I'm about to turn 36. But even I can remember growing up in a time like when I was a little kid, like I remember going to like a church Christmas service and getting an orange and a candy cane and that being a big deal because I don't
Yeah.
live at a place that oranges grow or that produces candy canes apparently. So it's like those were unique things like, whoa, we got an orange at Christmas kind of thing, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
Tropicana, man, stop in at your local whatever and get a gallon of the juice already squeezed. So it's like something about the like w- something about us wants all of it all the time now that almost negates the concept of the festival to me because it's just modernized 365 24/7 gluttony and excess. So I
Mhm.
like so the only thing that makes this different now is, like, people are like, there's a shortage of 12-foot skeletons at Home Depot now, and that's a news story. So the
Yeah.
that's like, for me, it's a little bit like, yeah, it feels like we're just wallowing and putting a gold star on the excess of insanity that we live in the midst of. So, yeah, maybe I could get on board with a classic, um I don't know what I'm saying. It's just those are the like the commercialized nature of what it
Mhm.
feels like to me continuously makes it hard for me to feel like this is a special occasion.
No, and I think that's more than fair, and yeah, for the record, I don't think that your average Halloween partier has any of this going through their heads, and I do think also that Bakhtin would look at what we have transpiring on October 31st and say, "This is a frail, frail shell of what I mean." It is
Ooh,
a pale imitation, and and the commercialization is part of that too. Yeah, you had an
so
idea.
can so here's a all right, run this one. The kind of the ideal of the academic and historical concept that he's laid out there and you've articulated for us also is in the context of cultures that had national fast days also.
Yeah.
So
So
can you have, like, feast days without fast days and have them still be meaningful? And I would say that is what I just pick on America here, is that we're doing all feast days and no fast days.
yeah.
So it disrupts the understanding of that higher cosmic order in our and the way we're situated in it.
No, that's a perfect entry point into what I was gonna say in response to your very good question actually about, yeah, we do this all the time. It's a nonstop festival for us with occasional costumes thrown in the mix and, lawn skeletons that are 12 feet tall. Yeah, no, so in order for what I was talking about to work well and in a healthy fashion, you need a healthy conception of the sacred,
Ah.
okay?
Mhm.
Yeah, which I would argue in the United States, we do not have. Not on a national level. I mean, there are plenty of folks who have basically, who obviously retain veneration of the sacred and the sense of the sacred, but as a culture, we do not. And in fact, as a culture, we are all frivolity and frankly, our humor, our ways of dealing with the difficulties of human life are fairly juvenile. We have to be honest here.
Well,
And I
can
think,
let
yeah,
me
we're,
interrupt here
we're much
because
more like, yeah,
you said something, I don't know if this is a sidetrack or right on line with it. You said something in a talk, I think it was back in the summer somewhere, and it was just like everybody cracked up, but you said America is the only country where people aspire to grow up to be teenagers.
that's right. Yeah.
How does that fit into this?
Well, because we have so fetishized youth as a culture, but also youth in the most superficial sense, not youth in the sense of vitality necessarily and freshness of experience, but more youth in terms of looking good and retaining lots of strength. Now, I want to be careful because I sound very much like a Debbie Downer here and I sound very negative and very judgmental. But as a nation, we really are obsessed with looking and feeling and acting young. And you see this crazy phenomenon in a lot of older people where the only conclusion you can draw based on their words, based on their comportment and the way they dress, what they're saying is, wow, they truly aspire to grow up to be a teenager. And many
So
of them, to their detriment, succeed.
so how does that work? I guess I see a overlap between the loss of the concept of the sacred and the perpetual.
Yeah.
Yeah, say
Well,
something
yeah,
about
because
that, if that connection is actually there or not.
the sacred involves, first of all, I mean, it involves some fun notions that we like. The notion that there's more to life than meets the eye, that there's something very powerful and life is charged with grandeur and significance, but it also entails some of those stuffy grown up words like a sense of responsibility, a sense of growing up, a sense of maturity, a sense of proper obligation and veneration in how you act. And so that would mean that the sacred would mean that you need temperance in your life. So are there seasons of festival and celebration? Absolutely. Human beings must have festival and celebration. I mean, another embodiment of the carnivalesque, think of the ghost of Christmas present from Charles Dickens, great, great story, right? He's basically a walking kind of carnivalesque figure. And that represents part of what we need to do to celebrate, to express joy, and yes, to laugh at in this side of eternity, to laugh at our foibles and to even laugh at death. I mean, that there's we've talked before about Peter Berger's signals of transcendence, and one of the signals of transcendence that he singles out is joking, humor, especially humor death jokes, because death jokes, if you're able to joke about your own mortal condition, in that there you have a note of transcendence to be able to do that.
Mhm.
But if you do nothing but joke about death, if you just mock it constantly and don't take it seriously at all, then you're going to lose touch with the actual reality of death, because part of death is also sorrow. But as
Mhm.
Christians, part of death is also the recognition that it is not permanent, and that Christ's resurrection profoundly reframes the way we see all of that. But all those elements have to be held in play. That's why I keep stressing that this stuff can get out of control very easily and very quickly, because there's a potentially chaotic energy in it. Something that is comparable here, also a beautiful thing with a beautiful purpose, is sex. All right, sex is a wonderful thing. God is the author of sex. It is a good thing. It has a specific purpose. It has a place. It has a context. It has a telos. It has a function and an arrangement. And it has tremendous energy and power. And that energy and power, when it's misused, can be chaotic and incredibly destructive. And the same is true of our need for celebration and our need for festival. It can be a beautiful way of putting things into perspective for us and helping us to have a healthy laugh at ourselves, or it can turn nihilistic and it can turn into anarchy. It really can, very quickly, and total revelry. I mean, you mentioned Mardi Gras. Just take a stroll down Bourbon Street and you will quickly see that violent excess that happens very quickly. And I think that's what puts a lot of us on guard, and rightfully so. Now, that doesn't mean it doesn't have a proper place. And I'm not arguing, by the way, that Halloween is the, you know, perfect expression of this by any means. I'm just pointing to a type of thing that has a place in human society when there is a proper sense of the sacred in place, and when it's properly controlled, and when there's a mature approach to it. Is that happening now? No, I don't think it is.
So, well, okay, so let's recap a little bit of, because I think this your signals of transcendence. I think in our conversations in years past, you've pointed this out, and I think it's right that there is an apologetic value to the fascination with this, in the sense that the spookiness and the interest in the spiritual world and that sort of thing, that there are things that happen during this time that remind people that they still either want that to be true, or they're still afraid of
Mhm.
that world in a way that makes them second guess. Now, I mean, you could kind of like, not to be too glib about it, but you could say, well, like cancer does that too. It makes us recognize
Sure.
there's brokenness and there's death. So, but it's not quite like that, in the sense that its only value is in kind of terrifying us into thinking about our mortality in the spiritual world. I'm
Yeah, no, I think no, you're no, this is good. I'm glad you said this, because I've omitted something huge that I think is really important about this time of year. The notion, so Halloween is magical. That's the other thing that's scary, and that's the other thing that puts people on guard, and it should. But why is it magical? Well, because of its past, and because of the imagery associated with it, and because of some of the practices that we've named here, it is pointing to the fact that this world is creepy, and that there's more to life than meets the eye, and that there are more, to quote Shakespeare, the famous quotation from Hamlet, that Horatio, there are more things in heaven and on earth than are dreamed of in your philosophy. That, as Christians, we know that is true. It really is. And I think sometimes it's interesting to see Halloween as a time, and its swelling popularity is not just pointing to our obsession with experimenting with identity. I think it is. And our obsession with partying. I think it is. But it's also pointing to the notion that people are very interested in the spiritual dimensions of existence. Now, they're very resistant, generally speaking, to religion or dogma or any kind of formal expression. But people are fascinated by the notion that life is filled with what they elements of you know, happenings and circumstances that they can't explain. And that all comes together again in a pretty heady way on Halloween and in
So,
the
okay,
movies that
yeah,
tend to come out around this time of year too, which all I think of a lot of modern horror films as dramas of belief. That's the way I often put it to people.
yeah, so that's how so you're talking let's go back to the Russian peasant stuck in the rut.
Yeah.
It is the and by the way, I think a lot of people are stuck in ruts today in all
Yeah.
sorts of categories of life. So I guess the question is, does the delight in the creepy like we would embrace the creepy because it gives us a sense of s- something about our lives mean more. So
Yes.
I think as a Christian, we would say, well, why would you celebrate the creepy in order to find significance in your life? But there is a sense in which this is a more socially acceptable form of play, as it were, with the
Yep.
spiritual. I'm using that as a very loose
Play is a good
quote and
word.
dangerous.
Yep.
Yeah, of like it allows us so that's the costume-esque to
Hmm.
you were saying our costumes provide a platform for experimenting with identity. Well, the wallowing in the creepy element gives us a platform for playing with transcendence and with the possibility that there's more going on than meets the eye, which I think could be seen as hope and desperation combined into one thing of my life is actually kind of depressing and I hope that there actually is more than meets the eye going on here. So that's in there at some form.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, but part of it is also just I think people testify to the fact that I mean, most people have had some experience that they can't explain in terms of regular occurrences in their lives. I'm a weird guy. I like to ask people about this when I meet new people, especially those who aren't Christians. I love to say, I mean, I do love to ask at some point. So, has anything ever happened to you that you just can't explain? And almost always, yes, they have. Now, they may not believe it was necessarily something that was demonic in nature or anything, but they will say things along the lines of, "Yeah, but to this day, I have no idea what happened." And I just simply can't explain it. I also like podcasts that have people talk about recount these stories. There are several
Mhm.
podcasts out there. I'm not naming them right now because I don't want to get in any more trouble than I already am. But there are podcasts that are what I love about these podcasts is that they have regular people, ordinary people from normal walks of life try to put into ordinary language extraordinary experiences. And there's something very interesting about hearing non-religious people try to capture that kind of an experience in normal traditional language. I find it really interesting. And Halloween is definitely a time that kind of showcases that. But also as a Christian, I would say it's not just that it's a it confirms, you know, it's gratifying to see, people's suspicions about there being something more confirmed, but also, I mean, we recently saw that close-up picture of what an ant looks like, an extreme close-up. We don't need Halloween to see how wild and creepy the world is. I mean, the Lord has made a fearsomely amazing and wild world, and both on a cosmic level and on an infinitesimal macro level. I mean, micro level. I mean, you just have an absolutely exuberant and really interesting, wild world that always exceeds our expectations. And so part of what I like about this time of year is that you have a little bit of growing kind of validation of that feeling that no,
Mhm.
life is mysterious, life is strange, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. That's only a bad thing, by the way, if your philosophy demands that you be a total control freak and have everything under complete and utter control, every category, everything. You've got it all at in the palm of your hands. But if you have a healthy recognition of your place as a human being, a contingent, finite being, none of that should come as a threat. It actually should be thrilling. I think a healthy response to the immensity of our world and reality is that it's yes, occasionally scary, but also thrilling.
Yeah. Well, so what's the difference? All right, let me try this one on you because I think that is essentially the same as a life of prayer. Now,
Right.
what I mean by that is that Halloween is like a commercial holiday that suddenly forms itself into thinking one day a year the way that I think about the world all the time in some
Right.
sense. And so think about it this way. I distinguish between magic and um let me start it back this way. So prayer is a form of non-physical causation, which usually we think like Newton's laws of physics, you push this, the thing moves, equal opposite reactions, objects at rest tend to stay at rest, all that kind of um but what happens when you pray? All causative prayer is mediated through another being, right? So when you pray
Mhm.
and God does something that enacts something physical in the world, that's non-physical causation. Like you didn't physically cause that thing to happen. You
Mhm.
did that by requesting it of another being who did the thing. So in Halloween, we're opening ourselves up to non-physical causation. Like, oh, that thing shouldn't have moved. Those lights shouldn't have flickered. There's not a physical explanation for what's going on there. So the occultish version is trying to control and manipulate that spiritual world to conform it to the
Mhm.
will of the human. And we can tell stories about that going poorly. Where the Christian version of that is trying to align our will to a good will that transcends us, who is also interested in what we're interested in our request and our petitions. And so there's a sense in which those who aren't spiritual but step into Halloween, there's a role there for the Christian to say, welcome. I
Mhm.
also believe in non physical causation. Tell me about your experiences with it because this is a world that I live in. So in some ways, we're like the experts in this. Um, and the reason I can say that, and you're like, "Oh, is Nathan just making stuff?" No, look at the whole way. Like when Moses had his showdown with Pharaoh, and God was doing signs through him. A bunch of Pharaoh's magicians could do stuff too. I mean, they responded to a lot of those things. They were calling on deities and entities and spirits and who knows what else to elicit physical reactions in the world. It went beyond illusion, apparently. Now, there's a power differential there. The God of Israel is able to do stuff that couldn't be replicated. The Witch of Endor, do you want to just say that when we talked about that, we made reference to that earlier? Do you want to say, oh, that's just a neat Bible story? Why were the spiritists and the medium? Because the spiritists and the mediums were real and did real stuff. And so it's not like as Christians we approach this and be like, "Oh, that's a bunch of weird stuff." You're like, "No, this is the world that we live in." If you have a biblical way of looking at reality, that it's deeply entwined in its physicality and in its spiritual reality, um, in a way that makes it weird to us when things are disembodied because we're meant to have bodies. Like that is the biblical story of the physical resurrection that you're not fully human until you have a renewed body and a resurrected, completed, put back together kind of thing. So all of these tensions and ideas and weirdness that are out there validate in so many ways the world as we believe it to be if we're followers of Christ. So I think then it comes down to the discernment of what are the elements that I can and can't participate in order to appropriately articulate and participate in a way that points to the way that I see the world and view it around that. And that will come down to discernment for different people in different contexts in different ways, probably. And Cameron and I will probably work that out differently. And I'm sure that's a conversation in your households too. But I really appreciate, Cameron, you kind of outlining, particularly the historical context and by taking it to the academic world, sometimes that sets us in a posture where we can think about these things structurally without
And
flinging
from a
knives
distance.
at each
Yeah.
other. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So thanks for doing that.
Hey, my pleasure. And it's always fun to discuss this with you. And thanks for tuning in once again. And I'm sure I'm predicting we're gonna get some mail on this one. And that's not clairvoyancy, by the way. That's just that's just an
Some
educated guess.
somebody's going to
But
dress up like a hydrocarbon. I just know it for Halloween. So
yeah, yeah, no, and real quickly, let me close on a humorous note. Speaking of, platform testing identities, all that fun stuff. Putting on a costume can also be a fun way to laugh at yourself. It can be it can be an invitation to exhibitionism, yes, and all that unhealthy stuff, but you can also laugh at yourself. So people have always told me I look like Cameron from Ferris Bueller's Day Off. Cameron is not the most enticing character in Ferris Bueller's Day Off. He's kind of negative and has a hard time, in social environments and social settings. So those who know me find this even more funny because this is a little on the nose. But I do look a lot like Cameron. My name is Cameron. So it is pretty funny for me to put on the hockey jersey and dress up like Cameron from Ferris Bueller's Day Off. And instead of, like every normal person, I worry about my appearance and I worry about, the way people perceive me and all that. So it's fun to just, yeah, laugh at myself and look like Cameron every now and then as I stroll through the neighborhood and let my kids get showered in candies. And yeah, I think it's mirthful, it's funny, it's self-deprecating in a good way, and yeah, I enjoy it. So that's there's a parting image for you. And
Yep.
if you haven't thought that before, next time you see me, that's going to go through your head. If you've seen Ferris Bueller's Day Off, great
Well,
film, Citizen Kane of comedies.
you've been listening to Thinking Out Loud, the podcast where we think out loud about current events, Christian hope, and I hope you survive your sugar rush.
Thanks for listening to Thinking Out Loud. If you'd like to learn more about what we do, book Nathan or Cameron, or if you'd like to support us financially, whether through a one-time donation or on a monthly basis, you can do so on the donate page at www.toltogether.com. That's toltogether.com. And please consider leaving us a 5-star rating and sharing this content with your friends. It really does help.